Hi everyone, I'm Airier, and today we're looking at overly sarcastic productions, Trope Talk, specifically Unreliable Narrators. This just came out, and this right here, this is going to be fun for me because I have a master's in fiction. What they're talking about right here is my absolute favorite type of inclusion in any form of writing, to either do or to be subjected to. And I do mean subjected to. Unreliable narrators are fun because it gives mystery to what the players expect to be real, having to compare to what it actually is, and always having that thought in the back of their head going, is this real? How much is real? What is real? Is it completely wrong? We don't know, but we're going to find out in a very good way later. I don't know, but I want to see how they're approaching this. I haven't seen any of their trope talks, but I've liked everything else Overly Sarcastic Production has done, so I'm really looking forward to this. This right here, this is sugar to me, which, considering how heavily caffeinated I am right now, is probably going to be very painful for my wife later tonight when we try and go to bed. But that's a problem for future me. So current me's going to enjoy this. So let's get started. You guys know the deal. Link below, original video. Hit it up. Let's get started. Okay, just being punched right in the face.
Every story with a narrator has a narrative voice. In simple terms, it's the tone and approach taken by the narration, which is basically all the parts of the story that aren't dialogue or...
Narrative voice, a perspective story told in the form of tone of narration. Arthur Dent was... Wait. Oh, Batman! Unless there's a different Arthur Dent. Grappling, conscious, one-way, grapples bar. Is this the afterlife he stammered? These bits. Oh, yeah, perspective, tone taken by the narration. So it's all the bits they're talking about outside of what's being said.
Inner monologue. Scene setting, physical descriptions, the actions a character takes, all these things make up the narrative voice of a typical prose story. The simplest...
To give an idea, if you're listening to a narrator in This Is What He Believed, it's usually where they bring in someone to do that voiceover that talks about everything that's not being seen or said by a character in a movie. That's a good way to vary it up if you're not nearly as understood about what is in a literary sense as opposed to a movie sense, because both actually use it.
Thing to nail down about it is whether it's in first, second, or third person.
God damn, you read from reminding me second person is a thing. There's not many books written in it, but I can think of one. It was a sci-fi novel, and everything was written as if you're updating your Wikipedia page for the entire damn novel, and it was just reading other people's Wikipedia pages, so you wrote it as you, because people were writing from their perspective, as if you were seeing through their eyes. It was all written in second person. I hated it. I hated it. I'm having flashbacks to a novel I refuse to mention from an author that I actually liked everything else they did, except for this one novel. I couldn't even stand the story because even though it looked kind of as good, I just couldn't. Every 5 seconds, it was like playing a choose your own adventure game, but all options where you don't get to choose and they suck. Wow, I was repressing more rage about that than I realized. Huh, that was good to get off my chest and immediately repress again.
First-person narrative voice talks in terms of I and we and me, taking the explicit role of a character in the story, retelling events that happened to them. A second-person narrative voice is more rare, talking in terms of you and yours, taking the role of an observer, describing the actions of the person they're dealing with. A third-person narrative voice is probably the most common, using...
And I wonder if they're going to get into the actual additions to that, where it's third person omniscient, third person narrow, third person where it's basically just aping first person, but you can't really tell because even though it's in third person, it kind of feels like first person, or where it's very specific third person, but it fluctuates a lot. We don't talk about third person omniscient. It's weird.
They and them and he and her to describe the actions of the characters from a wholly externalized perspective. A second or third person narration essentially implies the existence of a narrator character, intangible and unobservable, narrating the events of the story and the thoughts and insights of its characters from a...
And sometimes it's actually flat out stated where the narrator themselves is a character. Sometimes it's like in Lord of the Rings where you're basically reading the book that Bilbo and then later Frodo wrote, or sometimes it's because the author has no idea what the fuck they're doing and they think it's a dead person who didn't actually see it because they don't acknowledge anything of an afterlife. So it's just like, this is what I saw, but we're not going to acknowledge that. It's become more common to do that and people just roll their eyes and ignore it. In fact, it's not even a thing most people acknowledge anymore because it's become so common not to actually understand who you're writing their perspective from. It's just like, well, this is God. Is it God? I don't know. There's no gods in here, but is it God? It's basically God, but it's not God because there's no God. It's a very circular argument when you try and figure out who the narrator is when you don't actually know who the narrator is. And it's something you probably should figure out, but a lot of people just don't. It's like writing an entire scene from the perspective of one person in third person, but following exactly what they see, narrating their thoughts. And then when they die, in their characterization, you continue writing what they're observing when they're not there to observe it. That is a huge mistake I've seen so many times. Professional, fan fiction, student level, take your pick. It just happens. Sorry. Again, English major, got a master's in fiction. This is apparently something I have opinions about. And I thought this would be a fun one, but no, it's just reminding me of all the things I've actually been in heated arguments over. Huh.
A separated standpoint. And this is a very useful subdivision to draw, but it is not where the conversation about narrative voice ends. For one thing, these implied spectator mode narrator characters have varying levels of omniscience, how much they actually know about the story and can communicate to the audience.
And now we're getting to the part where I do like this, and thank God we're moving on rather than going to any of those other topics that I touched on, but they're just literary failings. I wonder if there's a trope for the author making a mistake and not realizing it. Would that be called plot holes or just stupidity? Both? Let's go with both.
Limited is probably the narrowest field of view. The narrative voice is limited to the thoughts and inner monologue of one character at a time, but will limit its narration of all other characters to the POV character's own observations.
And this is personally my favorite one because it's the least easy to fuck up. Is that a good reason to like it the most? Yes, because it means if someone knows what they're doing at a just general competence level, it's probably going to be good. Full omniscience, which apparently they're going to get to later, is very easy to do because you're just writing everyone's ideas everywhere, all the time, anytime, anywhere. And you can jump around from characters, but the problem is it gets so confusing so fast. Because if you aren't very careful and you slip into one character's point of view, then the other, with omniscience, you, the writer, would get who's writing it, who's speaking this, who's observing this. But sometimes you're writing for perspective and you're giving their thoughts and their emotions and their feelings. You slip into someone else, but you make the mistake of not identifying it, and it fucks everything up because you go from a freaking Godfather scene of, oh, here's what happened in the movie, and all the perspectives, all the people around, to what happened in the book, where it's the freaking assassination. You're jumping from one character observing to the next character observing it, and you have no idea who's speaking. Mario Puzo wrote a very interesting novel because he had to pay back an actual loan to actual gangsters, mafia at the time. And that book was written fast because it was that or his kneecaps. And this is one of those scenes where it's like, you know what? It looks better in the movie. And I'm if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a very confusing scene where he changed characters plenty of times in full omniscience, but wrote it as if each individual one was limited omniscience and didn't quite identify perfectly who each person speaking was. So it kind of got very confusing. The movie did it better because you actually see people. And just that visual component was enough. This is a much more heated video than I really was expecting. Wow, I was not expecting this. There's already been repressed rage, but no, this is apparently a therapy session today.
For instance, a third-person limited narrator might volunteer that the POV character is feeling tired or scared, but when discussing a different character, the narrator will only volunteer that the POV character thinks they're putting on a brave face. Objective is the narrative equivalent of a wide shot. This narrator doesn't have close-in access to anyone's thoughts and motivations and will instead simply narrate their actions in dialogue, leaving the audience to infer how they're feeling and why they're doing the things that they're doing.
Just one thing about this. This is basically what you have in movie perspective when you're writing for film. It's seeing everything without going into a movie where you then have a voiceover talking about their thoughts, or for full omniscience where you have a voiceover talking about the world. That's actually a very easy thing to start a movie with. I'm mostly relating to movie terms because most people know movies more than books. I know books more than movies because, well, I'm more or less socially non-existent. So if it's popular, I don't know it, which is why I got into writing probably. So objective is basically what you see. It's how you think. It's examining everything and then getting into it. It's also how a lot of people start trying to write in first person, realize they're not, and doing objective omniscience because they're just writing details about everything without getting into someone's head or other people's head or having the full information because they haven't written it yet. So I kind of really just ignored this one because I've only ever seen it used badly for fiction. In movies, it's how you're supposed to really get into it unless you take very specific stylistic choices.
And finally, omniscient is a narrative voice that knows what everyone is thinking and feeling, and can freely switch perspectives between different characters to show what anyone and everyone is feeling about the story. This might seem like a lot of trouble for a character that doesn't even really exist. Narration is invisible, the glue that holds prose storytelling together, because otherwise it would just be scripted dialogue.
And I should definitely point out, everything I've done is my take on what is and is not good based on how often people fuck it up. That should tell you everything there is about how important it is that my entire process of I like this style, I hate this style, is literally based on people fuck it up so much that it has made a lasting impact on me. I have had to literally study this, and that has inspired apparently a much larger point of rage than I realized. That is why this is important. Not just that it's the glue to hold it together, because when that glue's missing, you notice. It's like the seaweed in ice cream. Yes, that's a thing. If you notice it, something went wrong. And it's great when you don't. And it's great. It holds it together. Like, I think that's actually what the seaweed does. It literally holds it together too. But when you fuck it up and you notice the seaweed in it, you don't want to eat that shit. Because it would probably actually taste better if actual shit was involved. Because at least then you know immediately to run.
And stage directions. Narration is how the story describes itself, and because there's no way for language to be completely neutral and objective, the choices a writer makes in how a narrator, even a third-person omniscient narrator, describes the story they're dealing with implicitly creates a characterization for that narrator. There's a difference between saying a character said something and saying they hissed, or murmured, or managed, or yelled, or shrieked. They all feel different and mean different things, and imply.
And back to that point about how my impression here is based on how people import it. This is something that should be taught to everyone immediately. Not just writing majors, not just people in high school. I'm talking your words matter should be the very first thing you do in elementary school as soon as you understand what words are. Not just because it's the entire, oh, your words matter. They have an impact on people. It's because it literally is a difference between saying, read the description, bitch, to, would you kindly read the description, person who I do not know? Would that come up? Actually, if you're selling things online, yes, frequently. But it is so important because the exact same information, but with very different context, is so easy to ignore. It's also why people, frankly, I think should use emojis more, because in just general language, you can use something that sounds one way. You think it's one way, but it's not. We're probably getting to the unreliable narrator based on this because it's showing the bias here, but also when someone's biased, that means they have opinions. And when they have opinions, they might be missing information, which is also why I don't really like omniscient narrators, because they're supposed to have full, perfect knowledge. So either they're God, which is how we usually go to that, and what they say is, and that's only if you have the style of gods that is omniscient and is all-knowing and is all-powerful and is all-correct, because anything else is an omniscient narrator who's not omniscient, which inherently breaks the entire system. You see the point here? It gets really confusing the more you think about it. But yeah, just this. This is why I like unreliable narrators, because if they are talking out of their ass and you later decide they're talking out of their ass, you don't have to rewrite it. It was just them, not you making a mistake that you wanted to keep in there because it was really good in the moment. Actually, one of the stories that does this well is the Dresden Files, but that's probably more of the individual stuff they're going to get to in a bit.
Different things about the character they're describing, and thus indirectly imply things about the narrator holding that opinion. A supposedly distant narrator might describe a character as beautiful, or repulsive, or terrifying, or irresistibly attractive, with the implication that these opinions must be universally held because they're being stated by a character that's supposed to be neutral.
I'm going to say something kind of probably trigger a few people. I don't like Terry Pratchett. Nope, wait, Pratchett. Never mind, got the wrong person. This is Discworld. I love Discworld. That's amazing. Sorry, I got confused with a different author. Who's the guy who just kept writing all those books that were kind of fluff and they were just talking in circles and did nothing? It annoyed me so much, I actually wiped it from my memory. This is usually the point where I keep doing it until I remember and regret it. I'm going to stop here, actually. No, Terry Pratchett was amazing. And I think his was done well because he worked in absolutes, so absolute narration was perfect. Because the humor in his writing was the absolutes were usually very fucked up and wrong, and we knew that, but they wouldn't. And since it's literal God sometimes talking, it was like, oh, they're beautiful, when it didn't make sense. But it was treated that way, and it was funny for that reason. Unless I'm completely wrong about the author again, in which case, well, that sucks.
despite the fact that these are subjective assessments that would vary from character to character and audience to audience. If a writer isn't careful about this, the narrator can end up as an unintentional and invisible author self-insert, giving the writer's unfiltered perspective on the story they're telling, perhaps revealing implicit biases or blind spots on the part of the storyteller.
It's time for Deep Thoughts with Heinlein. Oh, by the way, subjective narration feels... Hash's own... Wait. Vivant Gourmet Cyprian, popular author extraordinaire and nepotism philosopher. All three amazingly beautiful, good secretaries, pleasantly plump, deliciously slender. Own granddaughter. Oh, yeah, you're seeing... Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein. For anyone wondering why they're highlighting this, I haven't figured it out yet. Yes, it's creepy because he's basically just fantasizing about his secretaries and then his granddaughter, because it's basically becoming a self-insert after all of this up here, talking about this highly respected author. I have my own issues with Heinlein. I'm not going to bring them up.
But the thing is, this is a feature and not a bug. A completely neutral narrator, if such a thing could even exist, would be distant and sterile and make the story needlessly difficult to parse. The fact is, the narrator is a character, and that character has a voice. And while some stories make that explicit by having the narrator be one of the named characters recounting the story from their perspective, some story formats make this less obvious, and the characterization of the narrator is really only demonstrated in the specific ways they choose to describe.
And I should probably point out, a lot of people who write, both new authors and old authors, forget this. And they just start putting words down without thinking what perspective it is, because if they don't understand the perspective, it might shift without them realizing it. And then they have to go back and fix things. It's really a horrible issue that I definitely am not speaking from experience having done that. And it was not entirely annoying. I didn't spend weeks on doing a few minutes of not thinking it through in advance. And I could have figured everything out and it saved so much time. I'm not salty.
The plot and characters. The narrative voice has opinions and biases and finds certain things funny or worth pointing out, while others might be glossed over as irrelevant. In a medium with a narrator, the narrator becomes a lens through which the audience experiences the thoughts and actions of every other character. Which means, on the most basic and technical level, every narrator is an unreliable narrator. A theoretically perfectly reliable narrator.
And that's also the part a lot of people forget, because some people will say the narrator is omniscient. And all that rant I went on, it's all that. They're all supposed to be a narrator. But it just gets so annoying when someone's like, well, I said this, so it's true. This is my own personal gripe. Some people do it really well. I've always been annoyed every time I hear that, because it just sounds to me like it's someone who doesn't know what they're writing, not sure what to say, and then they're just covering up by saying, well, this is how it is. Personal gripe, this may or may not be your thing, but for me, absolutes are not done well unless you know they're absolute and they're intentionally wrong, so they're funny, but that's a different thing we already talked about.
Would explain absolutely everything that's happening, so the audience is fully briefed on the intricacies of the story, which is
I'm not going to ask where this is from. It probably is from something.
Because at bare minimum, language itself isn't that precise, and broadly, it would just take way too long. There will always be room for confusion and interpretation, but aside from a certain baseline background radiation of unreliability, there are many ways for a narrator to be notably unreliable. It's generally expected that a narrator or POV character is being honest and correct about what's happening, at least to the extent of their ability to understand it. But what happens when that's not true? Now, the convenient thing about this line of questioning is it actually takes us out of the prose-only zone.
Oh, please tell me she brings up autobiographies. Please tell me she brings up autobiographies and memoirs. Those are the most fictitious books you can ever find. You want to see something true? Read fiction. Read fantasy. Read things so detached from reality that you have to work your ass off to establish a level of realism. So things have to be as true as possible when they are, in any way, shape, or form, relatable. And when they're not, you have to establish them really well. But things that are not, autobiographies and memoirs, where it's like, well, we're playing a lot of factors here, but all of them are things that exist in reality, so we don't have to establish any of that because we know reality is real. So everything else, well, this is what I think. And if I think it's real, that's good enough because it's the autobiography or memoir. So it's exactly what I thought. You want to find a bunch of, let's go with the nice words, fiction. Read something that says it's true. because it's basically that issue I just had right here about how the omniscient narrator is lying and they don't realize that, and they're not taking their bias into account. They're not taking the fact that they have their own opinions into account. It's an autobiography and a memoir because that's just, here's the truth, not the truth as I see it. It's a very small distance, but it's one that I'm pretty sure they're about to get into here. I really hope they pull that out.
See, most mediums of storytelling don't have narrators because most of them don't need narrators. In prose writing, the narrator is the only way for the story to set the stage, paint the picture of the setting for the audience, tell us how the characters look and act, and broadly, the only way for the story to communicate information to the audience that the characters themselves wouldn't immediately want to volunteer. If you want to get across to your audience that a character is a redhead with green eyes and freckles, unless that character feels like saying those things out loud, it's gonna have to come through from the narrator. This stops being true as soon as a visual element is introduced to the story. So comics, picture books, shows, and movies don't need narration, and in fact often suffer.
Oh, Duncan Idaho. Yeah, it actually is Dune. Huh. I want to go back a bit. I haven't seen the comic before.
So comics, picture books, shows, and movies don't need narration, and in fact often suffer from its inclusion, because audio narration can feel like a clumsy and abstract way to communicate plot beats in a visual medium. Without a narrator, it might seem difficult to have an unreliable narrator, but even in
Wait. They actually had audio narration of visual elements. And if they say Southern Temple, this was probably, oh God, was this the Avatar movie? You know what? I never saw that movie because I heard it was bad. And this is just reminding me I made the right decision.
Beats in a visual medium. Without a narrator, it might seem difficult to have an unreliable narrator. But even in stories that don't have third-person narrators, you can have unreliable narration or an unreliable narrative, which is good because otherwise it would be really hard for me to put visual examples in this video. The easiest way to justify having an unreliable narrator in a non-prose medium is to have a character in the story tell a story. This character thus takes on the role of a first-person narrator for the...
Oh, yeah, Name of the Wind. It's literally that entire setup, that what they did there. It's the current action with the main character and everything's from his perspective, and then the story he tells where he becomes the narrator, not the main character. Although he's then narrating himself as a kid as the main character and gets called on the fact that some of the things he say don't actually match up with reality, or as he saw it. I personally don't like this because it's just too many layers of narration for me. It gets into the entire Inception zone where it's the story within a story. I'd rather just get to the main story that was interesting in the first place rather than the person telling a story and then being told about the person telling a story. That's just my own pedantic reasoning, though. Some people love this setup, like are rabid and will hunt it out more than isekai fans at an anime convention going gaga off the nearest schlock being put out.
Benefit of the other characters in the story. This can be a framing sequence for an entire movie or a full episode of a show, where the story begins with a character starting their story and ends shortly after they finish. Maybe the characters are all sharing ghost stories around a campfire, or someone is being interrogated by the authorities about what they did for a recent heist or crime, or the characters are reading through another character's diary, or a movie opens with narration from an unseen, much older version of one of the characters we're about to meet, or maybe several characters are all weighing in on their side of a big story, Rashomon style. In these scenarios, the characters can all be expected to be biased by their personal eccentricities.
I know these are all really good examples, and I'm just going to stand by what I said. I just don't like this example. I don't like it. It's personal opinion on this one. I know some people love it, and hell, it made its way into the good Batman. The one that is basically, as far as I'm concerned, the canon Batman that all others should be taken from. Not just because Mark Hamill did the best Joker ever. Okay, partially because of that.
And that means the writer can get a lot of mileage out of letting every character tell the story unreliably in a way that makes sense for them. We get to see how the characters flanderize each other in their own exaggerated ways. If two characters dislike each other, the way they characterize each other is liable to be cartoonishly evil, or cruel, or otherwise hilariously out of character. A prideful egotist might tell a story where they're the heroic champion that single-handedly saved the day by fighting off a truly implausible number of bad guys. A villain might cast themselves as the victim. A parent might censor the swear words and steamy bits of a story they're telling their kid. A child's version of a story is liable to be a bit more unfocused than an adult's. This is a way to reinforce characterization.
You know, I really wish I didn't have this covering the words there. You both said the thing with the spaghetti, but that can't possibly be real. You mock my suffering? Who would lie about pasta? Is this from something I just don't notice it, or?
While also giving the audience a fun mystery to puzzle through. What parts of the story are true? What parts are exaggerated? What really happened? In cases where only one character is telling the story, so we can't cross-reference with anyone else's version, we're often directed to take them at their word for the bulk of the runtime, only for doubt to be cast on them at the very end for a fun twist reveal. Maybe that.
Oh, yeah, and actually that's the part I really love, because that right there, that is so good, because it lets you be wrong in a believable way where it doesn't feel like a plot hole. And that lack of a plot hole is so massively important, because if the character's wrong because the author fucked up, that gets annoying. It rubs it in your face that this is something that wasn't finished, that wasn't polished, that could have taken a little more time, and they just rushed it out because fuck it, I'm done. Which admittedly is actually a perfectly fine reason to finish something, because sometimes you really just have to say fuck it, I'm done. But more often than not, it's because it was rushed and you just got it out, it's done. Being wrong intentionally is great. I mentioned the Dresden Files earlier. A lot of Jim Butcher's writing style, and he actually talked about this in both Afterwards and audio podcasts he was on, was that he wrote from a character's perspective, and sometimes his thoughts about what's going on, his beliefs and how he interpreted the world, or what he even wanted a story to be, changed radically over the course of, oh God, it's decades now, isn't it? Decades. So what he initially had coming from the character's perspective could be wrong, because it was always from a perspective that was unreliable based on their own experiences. So it was as true as they could make it with faulty and incomplete information. An unreliable narrator talking about what they have right here and what she just said, so that things can be wrong in a twist, as opposed to a continuing series where the information changes. But that's not a change. It's just new information being delivered that you find out about that recontextualize everything, and also happens to be a retcon without being a retcon. So they're not actually changing the old information. They're just giving context that was not there beforehand. It's my personal favorite way to use an unreliable narrator.
The happy ending they described was wishful thinking, or the story is revealed to be an elaborate lie. Broadly, there are 3 ways narrators can be unreliable. The first and most obvious is if they are lying liars.
Flat out.
These narrators will flat out deceive characters and audiences alike by either misrepresenting events or leaving out key information. Like, for instance, and in those intervening 10 minutes, I totally killed that guy. The second type are ignorant or inattentive. These narrators aren't intentionally misrepresenting the story, but they don't really understand what's going on, so they're
a good example of this would be The Great Gatsby early on, where he sees a lot of things, but you don't have context for it because he's just looking at the glam. There's enough information there that you as a reader can pull out details, and especially in a second read you can do it. But initially, you don't get that unless you really look into it.
Version of events might skip past key details they've missed and be broadly not very useful. This is most common in story within a story settings because it can easily be played for comedy if the narrator chooses to focus on a seemingly incidental detail while extremely significant things are happening in the background. And the third type is hallucinatory. These narrators...
Hallucinatory? Oh, it's supposed to look like Hatsune Miku, I think? I am not actually your girlfriend. That does make sense. Oh, makes sense. That's a K.
Are also not intentionally misrepresenting the story most of the time, but their actual perception of reality is unreliable because the way they perceive their surroundings is not how they're really happening.
Although I would make one little exchange there. It's not even that it has to be an unrealistic perception of reality, as long as you filter it through someone's perspective. And I personally like that take, rather than what they're seeing is wrong, to what they're seeing is what they see it as. It's a very small thing, and I think it's closer to reality because no one has reality. We all see in our own perceptions and our own biases, and that's how we perceive it. So it's more accurate. It actually feels closer and more able to establish verisimilitude, a seemingness of reality when you do it that way. Because people aren't perfect. So when you have a character who views the world in a non-perfect way, and occasionally it bites them, it makes them more realistic, as opposed to where it's a perfect person who makes a mistake and it's just highlighting that this is the author fucking up. Again, I keep coming back to the biggest issue with this being people fucking up, not the story itself fucking up. That's my own personal take, just because it's so easy to make mistakes. So easy. And when you do it well, it flows well. It's just good.
This works quite well in visual mediums because the camera can show what the character is perceiving with subtle hints that it's not exactly bound by physical laws or shot continuity. Unreliable narration can also be used for dramatic irony if the character narrates a situation playing out one way while the audience sees it play out differently, presumably how it really happened, giving the audience information that the characters hearing the story don't have. A character...
I almost want to skip this because I still haven't seen any of the Spider-Verse movies. I'll be fine. It's only a scene.
They might describe themselves as totally in control of their life, while the camera treacherously reveals them to be a hot mess. In contrast, a character might also describe themselves as lame or uncool or broadly disliked, only for the objective POV to show them surrounded by people who like and value them, and only their insecurities are making them tell the story that way. This is again used to highlight the character and their unique traits. The way they tell a story tells us something useful about this character, how their own perceptions color reality, and how honest they're willing to be with themselves or the people around them.
And again, sometimes it's not even played in such a way that it's done to show that they're looking at it one way or the other. Like I said, Jim Butcher's method, where it's as true as they can make it, but they're not working with complete information. It's, again, I keep saying it's my favorite part because it gives so many options for later development, intentional or unintentional, and it just works well that way.
This is very useful stuff, but the versions we've been discussing have all been safely compartmentalized in a story within a story and used for the purpose of highlighting a character's unique wackiness in the way they specifically see the world. And
I mean, technically everything you just said would also apply to just regular storytelling as well from any narration point, and it doesn't have to be contained with only a story within a story. Unless you're looking at it as strictly any story is someone else telling the story and you're reading their perspective, but I'm going to ignore that because most people do.
And tell their story. In these scenarios, we typically trust that the camera outside that story within a story is still going to be honest with us about what's really going on. This is not always true, and that's where things can start getting complicated. When an unreliable narrator has control over the entire story, things start getting dicey. In general, an audience will start a story trusting that the story is not lying to them. It likely isn't telling them everything. Even an omniscient perspective typically keeps the camera pointed away from the really juicy reveals, but the audience generally trusts that what they're seeing is what's really happening. They don't go into a story assuming the story is going to lie to them. However, there are ways a writer can clue in the audience that they should start being suspicious. Maybe characters are acting strangely or inconsistently, or backgrounds are shifting in ways that don't make sense, or continuity errors are cropping up between shots. An audience might begin to get suspicious, and will generally have those suspicions confirmed fairly soon after the evidence piles up. The suspicious scene might be revealed to be a dream, or a simulation, or a hallucination, or somebody's mind palace, or a brief glimpse into an alternate timeline, or any number of plot-based hand-wavy justifications the writers can use to briefly bait and switch the audience with an impossible or deeply unlikely scenario. This can be a lot of fun, but it has a
as discussed in the All a Dream trope talk. Ooh, I want to see that one. They're horrible, horrible tropes because they're usually terribly done. I'm looking at you, Windfish.
detrimental effect on audience investment in the long term. If they've already done the nightmare sequence or the holodeck training program trick enough times, the audience might start feeling broadly unworried when a situation looks particularly perilous, because it's even odds it's not even really happening. This means when it turns out to actually be happening, the audience has to play catch up on their investment, and unfortunately, if the audience has picked up on
Reichenbach, continuity errors, plot holes, and or clues during the break-in at the tower? I have no idea where this is taken from. Sherlock? Maybe that's what it is.
Clever clues that the scenario was fake.
Oh, it's from Sherlock,
like
okay.
Making no sense or continuity errors in the shot. That goes from being very cool and smart writing to subtly hint that the events aren't really happening to the unfortunate realization that it's actually just bad writing and poor set management.
That point I said about just bad things are the reason I hate some styles and love others. This is kind of why. You can only cover it up so much. When you get it right, though, it's great. When you do it wrong, yeah. I do like it when you can establish the narrator is lying, but only because you think it's telling the truth, and it comes out whenever things are showing you that their big reveal is that the narrator was lying to you. It's also been done plenty bad, plenty often. There's actually quite a few authors in the late 1800s, early 1900s that played around with that in some of the Western-style fiction, and specifically in short stories. I also remember that I distinctly hated most of them, so I can't really say that's a good example.
It's a risky trope to overuse because it hits with less punch every time and diminishes the punch of the
Yeah.
actual non-fake plot twists. And it can train an audience to pick apart your writing looking for clues, which is of course a good and fun thing for any
If you're
audience to
good.
do, but it can be a bit disheartening for the writer regardless. But of course, one easy way to avoid that issue is to tell only one self-contained story, like a standalone book or movie, and having that turn out to be an unreliable narrative, because that means that there aren't later installments for the audience to disbelieve. One relatively common way this plays out is a reveal near the end of the story that the POV character has been hallucinating for large portions of it, and whole scenes didn't happen or didn't play out the way they thought they did. Or
Oh, this is not the example I was expecting because I have no idea where that's from. This might count as spoilers, but Fight Club. If you know what I'm talking about, you realize I'm referring to how the entire movie was actually entire hallucinations on his part, where he was the only person there, but he had an alternate persona that may or may not be real. He's not entirely sure who's the persona taking over at the end, and that's actually debatable. And it was left intentionally vague because officially it makes it more thought-provoking. Unofficially, because the writer decided it was funny and they just left it that way because people arguing on the internet is really good for sales when they have to pick apart the book and generate more talk about what they did. Come on, think about it. It actually, unfortunately, makes sense.
Where characters' memories have specifically been tinkered with, and any flashbacks and recollections
I do
they
not know
had
that
aren't
movie,
what
though.
they seemed to be. These reveals usually hit late in the game and make a lot more sense on a second viewing, where the audience can be on the lookout for particularly exciting hints at the break in reality. Of course, once you
So how much of the cool stuff I liked was actually meaningful? Somewhere between 9% and none of it. Be warned, Reddit will think none of it is very cool and smart. This almost feels like it's specifically talking about a specific show or book. I'm not sure which one.
establish the idea that the POV character's perceptions can't be trusted, on a certain level, that's kinda game over. For the purposes of this story, the audience can no longer be convinced that anything they're seeing is real. It has a similarly disengaging effect to the all a dream twist, since it confirms that the story can and will pull the rug out from under the audience, and it's pretty much impossible to take anything the story presents at face value anymore.
I should probably point out, having an entire audience lose faith in what they're seeing is real is kind of crazy when the entire concept of fiction is none of this is real and you're intentionally engaging with it, but then having it rubbed in your face it's not real breaks the verisimilitude. That's why it doesn't work, because engaging with fiction means you have to dispel the sense of this isn't real. You have to treat it as if it's real to you, as this is a real story you're engaging with. That's how you can get over little plot holes. And if you can't, they become unbearable, and that's why fiction falls apart. So the entire idea of it's just a dream, breaking it over and over again and getting rid of tension is literally breaking the entire concept of fiction. And I have a feeling when I finally watch this video about It's All a Dream, I am going to have a lot of words about this, won't I? Yeah.
Anymore. Most of the time, this is a feature and not a bug, since this reveal usually hits when the story is already almost over, and it can be very cool for an audience to go back through a story like that and catch all the hints and double meanings they missed the first time through. If the story doesn't have to convince the audience that they're seeing something that's really definitely happening, it isn't a problem that they basically can't convince them anymore. But this can become an issue in serialized media or other long-form storytelling, because if the story gets...
I'm just saying, the last time you fell off a cliff, it turned out to be a dream your psyche was having. Feels pretty real to me, though. Yeah. Again, I'm coming back to the Dresden Files as the best way to use Unreliable Narrator because it's the lack of information from people who are growing and finding out more to recontextualize. So you can have those kind of thoughts and you can have that kind of tension as long as it's well managed, as opposed to these kind of cliffhangers. Like, it's literally a cliffhanger. Wow. Was it from the movie Cliffhanger itself where that was starting, or a serial that used that trope a lot? I don't actually remember. Yeah, serials, when they don't manage it well, when they keep with all the information we have is correct immediately, as opposed to all the information we have is correct as far as we know. Small difference, but it's so important. I keep coming back to it because it's so freaking needed to remember that when you're writing.
It's too comfortable playing with the audience's perceptions of reality, then as mentioned, the audience is going to disinvest. And if the writing gets too shoddy, the audience might literally refuse to believe it's actually happening. The problem is only worsened if the writer gets cute with it, as they so often do, like having a character snap out of a horrifying unreality into a scene where they're being rescued, which in turn dissolves into a horrifying unreality until they wake up to being rescued again, but for real this time. It's pretty understandable that both the characters and the audience might have a little...
The multiple wake-ups, it's literally just forcing you to go through the entire plot of Inception over and over again to the point where you don't actually care anymore.
Trouble believing the story is actually ending the way it says it is. And unfortunately, just like in all a dream scenarios, this is technically an interpretation that could be applied to literally any story ever. The idea that a story is being told by an unreliable narrator lying to the audience is technically always true, because the writer is lying to the audience by telling them a story in the first place.
Yeah!
This is one of those foundational elements of storytelling.
Ooh, they're actually pointing it out. Sorry, this is something I talk about a lot, so the fact they're actually pointing it's like, oh, dude. Sorry, I'm literally nerding out right now. Suspension of disbelief, choosing to not exercise critical thinking or logical skepticism to better enjoy a story for what it is, becomes difficult if the story punishes you for it. You know, this exact definition reminds me of a few other things that I'm not going to comment on because they're a bit too on the 24-hour news network.
Like the fourth wall, where if the writer starts poking at it too hard, it can destabilize the storytelling process itself. It's literally an attack on suspension of disbelief. In order to fully enjoy a story, an audience can't be too hung up on the fact that the story doesn't necessarily make 100% sense or isn't 100% convincing in the effects department. The story could be critiqued or nitpicked for errors or speculative fantasy that doesn't necessarily make sense, but doing so damages the audience's ability to take the story at face value. So when an audience suspends their disbelief, they're choosing not to do that in order to remain immersed in the story. This is why.
And I specifically love that they're highlighting Samwise Gamgee, so Frodo, so Lord of the Rings, because this is one of those things about fantasy that requires the most suspension of disbelief. So establishing it is very difficult. But it also means it's a really well thought out world, so things are usually really well done. The fact that the eagles being big isn't what people fix on. It isn't that there's magic or it's a completely unreal world. It's that the eagles could have just flown them there, even though they had ballista that could have shot the eagles down. Is that the actual reason? No, he actually said in an afterword that he wrote in and actually left in a few of the various copies of his novels, specifically Tolkien left in Fellowship of the Ring, that the reason he wrote the story like he did is because he wanted to write a long adventure novel and see if he could do it. And he did, and it was fun, and he succeeded in every way he wanted to of just being able to have a fun, long adventure.
This is why things can get tricky when the story tells the audience that they should have been disbelieving them the whole time, because actually the story was a lie. It can be an exciting and unusual approach to storytelling because it directly encourages the audience to critically examine what they're seeing rather than taking the characters at
Spoilers, Sixth Sense, he was a ghost all along. It's that. That's basically that. That's where it's like, see, it was all a lie the entire time, but also a good example of the character was telling the truth as far as they knew. Turns out what they knew was working on incomplete information. Again, that's the best way to do it. Not that they're lying, is that they thought they were telling the truth. Small difference.
At face value, but if they take that far enough, or rather if the writer directs them to take that far enough, the audience's ability to stay immersed can be deeply compromised. In the end, the audience won't know when to trust the story, and if the story does something they dislike, they might choose to believe that it was a lie too.
For example, if that Sixth Sense reference again, if it turns out he was a ghost all along, but then right before the end of the movie, you saw him going up to a grave and finding it empty, and he wasn't dead all along. But then he was dead all along. See what I mean? The more of those shocks you add on, the stupider it gets and the less you care or believe about it. It works once. Pull the same thing twice? No.
The author makes too much of their story a canonical lie. They lose the ability to control the audience's belief in what they're telling them. So, yeah.
Oh, just any of there? It makes sense. Okay, so as much as I love this, I gotta remember, I can't do these videos caffeinated. The next time I do a trope talk, no coffee, well rested, happy place. Because apparently, repressed rage due to literal near decade of school involving writing for a freaking master's, I have opinions, and all of them seem based on my own hatred of stupid. This was both incredibly fun and seeing concepts I love talking about and getting information like, oh yeah, there's also these other ones I know about, but I keep forgetting because I haven't talked about them in decades. Decade. Oh God, it's actually been a decade. Fuck me. But I can't do this caffeinated because it would literally kill me. I am so hyped right now and both excited and elated for how happy I am right now for seeing this, but also there were moments that I just... You know what I'm talking about. There were moments where punching the screen seemed like a very worthwhile option. This was good, though. I'm glad I jumped in. I love seeing this. I kind of wish they had talked about the one other aspect where it's an unreliable narrator because of incomplete information. It's a small thing, and I think it's just one that needs to be specifically hyped because it's technically a part of what she covered, but it's a technique of how to implement it. So it's a smaller step down from even what they covered in a very small, minutia style of way. And also just the general bullshit of unreliable narrators in fiction. But that's not so much a narrator in a sense of the trope, as in people are wrong, but they say they're not. In fiction, it's a technique. In reality, it's an autobiography. I keep coming back to that, and I could probably do an entire novel about that, and people have that. There's entire novels and books written about how much people writing novels about themselves are bullshit. Usually they're takedown novels, and that's an entire genre in its own right, and usually one that's absolutely fucking terrible. But that's my own personal opinion there. More importantly, though, if you haven't already, there's a link below to the original video. Hit it up. I'm going to go do something that's not writing related so I don't get absolutely triggered by more, admittedly, really cool and really dumb stuff that reminds me of. Yeah, this was a complicated video in ways I was not expecting. I'll be warned next time. And knowing me, I'll probably forget and stumble into the same problem all over again with probably more coffee. I do not learn from my mistakes, do I? Huh? Nope. Oh, well, that's a problem for future me. I like the fact I'm probably heading to bed in the next 20 minutes and I'm still hyped up on coffee in this entire video. Oh, I have made a mistake. And it's now future me's time, so it's now current me again. God damn, you passed me. Past me was a dick. Otherwise, you guys know the deal. Link below, original video, hit it up. I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios.